what if the seemingly objective news you read every morning over coffee
Right.
is actually like being written using the exact same narrative formula as a Star Wars movie?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds totally absurd on the surface, right? You read a piece on, I don't know, geopolitical conflict or some local crime, and you just assume you're getting raw data. But there's an underlying architecture to it.
Right. And I think we've all felt it. You know, you read a headline and there is this invisible agenda kind of pushing you. You feel this subtle tug on your emotions.
Exactly.
It's like a prompt telling you who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and exactly how you're supposed to feel about them. You might not be able to articulate it, but you know the script has already been written. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a massive, comprehensive look at a very specific, highly provocative interview from the WNL show.
Right, the one featuring Michiel Lieuwma.
Yes, exactly.
And, you know, Lieuwma is just a fascinating figure to break this down. He's a Dutch theater maker, he's an author, and a really sharp media critic. The conversation he had on WNL, it doesn't just skim the surface of media bias, it digs all the way down into the historical and psychological bedrock of how the West currently perceives reality.
Which is wild, and the stakes here are really high for this one. We're trying to understand why our culture feels so incredibly fractured right now.
Yeah, totally.
Why the good versus evil narratives of our time are shaping literally everything, from how an international tragedy is reported all the way down to, you know, who gets a local municipal arts subsidy.
Right, but before we really get into the weeds, we should probably establish the parameters of what we're doing here today.
Absolutely. So to you listening, I will be explicitly clear right off the bat. We are going to be exploring Lieuwma's highly specific and, let's be honest, often very controversial frameworks. Our goal today is not to take a political side.
Right, no endorsements here.
Exactly. We aren't here to advocate for the left, the right, or anything in between. Our mission is just to impartially convey the ideas Lieuwma presents so that you can understand his unique lens on the modern culture war.
Yeah, we are basically looking at the architecture of his argument, setting the blueprints out on the table for you to examine.
Because the mechanics of how narratives are constructed, I mean, that affects everyone.
Oh, 100%. If you want to understand that invisible tug you feel when reading the news, you have to look at the machinery pulling the strings.
Right. And to see that machinery in action, Lieuwma starts with a hyper-local controversy in the Netherlands. It acts as this perfect microcosm for the global issue. He points to a situation at a venue called Pacuis de Zwijger.
Yeah, and for those outside of Amsterdam, we should clarify, this isn't just a random community center.
No, not at all.
It is a massive, highly influential debate and cultural hub. It receives huge amounts of municipal subsidies. We're talking over €500,000. And it's positioned as the absolute bastion of progressive thought, open dialogue, and civic engagement.
Right. It's the kind of institution that actively prides itself on hosting difficult, uncomfortable conversations. The whole idea is that it's a safe space for radical ideas.
Exactly.
But Lieuwma zeroes in on this glaring contradiction in how they curate that quote-unquote open dialogue. Recently, Pacuis de Zwijger hosted an event organized in solidarity with the Gaza flotilla.
Right.
And during this event, they gave a platform to speakers who are widely documented as Hamas-affiliated activists. One of the speakers, a man named Abu Anarm, has actually been officially sanctioned by the United States for terror support.
Which is wild. They just handed him the microphone under the banner of open debate.
Exactly. And here's the whiplash. That exact same venue, with the exact same stated commitment to open dialogue, they outright canceled an appearance by a man named Ruud Koopmans.
Which really requires us to look at who Ruud Koopmans actually is.
Right.
Because he is not some fringe internet provocateur or a radical political operative. He is a very mainstream, highly credentialed migration sociologist.
He was actually invited to speak at the venue by the Migration Advisory Council. It was just supposed to be an academic discussion about the extreme complexities of modern migration.
Yeah, but the venue management stepped in and shut it down. They deemed Koopmans too, quote-unquote, right-wing, because his sociological research places some critical footnotes next to the prevailing progressive consensus on migration.
So Lieuwma looks at this and asks a very structural question, right? Like, how does an institution justify platforming an individual sanctioned for terror ties while simultaneously barring the door to a mainstream academic sociologist?
And the key here is that Lieuwma doesn't view this as a simple HR glitch.
Right, or just a localized bad decision by one venue manager.
Exactly. He sees it as a symptom of a systemic lens. And to prove this isn't just happening in Amsterdam debate halls, he scales the argument up to the global media landscape.
Yeah, this is where he compares two Very distinct, highly tragic case studies.
And this is where his argument gets incredibly uncomfortable, honestly, but it's vital for understanding his framework. He asks us to look at the death of a young white man in the United Kingdom named Henry Novak.
Novak was fatally stabbed in a horrific altercation,
Right.
and his attacker was a Sikh man. In the Sikh tradition, initiated individuals carry a small ceremonial dagger known as a kirpan. This individual used his kirpan to stab Novak. And when the police arrived on the scene, as Novak was literally dying, his final words to the officers were, "I can't breathe."
It is an absolute tragedy. Just an awful localized nightmare.
It really is. But Lieuwma directs our attention to the media's reaction to it. If you were to search for Henry Novak on the NOS, which is the major Dutch public broadcaster, essentially their equivalent of the BBC, his name appeared in exactly one isolated article and maybe one short video clip.
Yeah, the story just evaporated almost instantly. It was treated as a random, unfortunate local crime statistic.
But then, Lieuwma immediately contrasts that silence with the death of George Floyd in the United States. George Floyd, a black man, was murdered by a white police officer.
Right.
And his dying words were exactly the same. "I can't breathe."
And the media reaction to George Floyd was, as we all know, just wall to wall.
Yeah, it wasn't just a story. It was the story.
Exactly. Within hours, there were massive systemic analyses, global protests, countless op-eds. It framed an entire year's worth of narrative about structural racism, police brutality, and the historical oppression of the West.
So Lieuwma's pointing at these two identical, tragic utterances, "I can't breathe," and asking how the exact same media apparatus can have two wildly divergent responses.
Right. Why does one spark a global systemic reckoning while the other is buried in a single forgettable paragraph?
And to add to that, Lieuwma points out how the resulting unrest is framed. He notes that the Volkskrant, which is a major Dutch newspaper, covered the Black Lives Matter protests as being almost exclusively peaceful. When rioting and looting did inevitably occur in certain cities, the paper published pieces suggesting that the violence was actually the work of white supremacist infiltrators who were just trying to ruin the peaceful marches.
Right. They went to great lengths to protect the core morality of the protest.
Yes. But conversely, when a simple women's march took place in the Dutch town of Loosdrecht, the progressive media immediately used guilt by association to frame it.
Oh,
They
right.
visually and narratively linked these women marching to late-night, violent hooligan riots that just happened to occur in the same geographic area. The nuance was entirely stripped away.
So Lieuwma interprets this as a profound double standard, but the crucial part of his theory is why this double standard exists.
Okay, let's unpack this, because my immediate reaction to this is that it's like watching a sports game where the referee is incredibly biased.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
It's like the ref only calls fouls on the reigning champions. The underdog team can throw elbows, they can trip players, play as dirty as they want, and the ref just swallows the whistle. But if the champion team breathes too hard, they get a penalty.
Right.
So if everything in the news is truly this skewed, aren't journalists losing the plot of reality? Like, are they sitting in editorial meetings, rubbing their hands together, actively conspiring to bury the Novak story and inflate the Floyd story? Are they intentionally lying?
According to Lieuwma, no. He doesn't believe in a conscious, smoke-filled room conspiracy at all.
Interesting.
He argues that modern progressive media and cultural programmers like the ones at Pakhuis de Zwijger are operating on a completely subconscious framework. And this brings us back to your hook at the beginning of the show. He calls it the Star Wars worldview.
Which is just such a wild concept to apply to journalism. I mean, he means the literal narrative structure of George Lucas's universe, right?
Yes, exactly. Think about the moral universe of Star Wars. It is aggressively simple and binary. On one side, you have the Empire. The Empire is represented by Darth Vader. They are dressed in black, they are technologically superior, they are a massive bureaucracy, and they ruthlessly colonize the galaxy. They are the ultimate oppressor.
And on the other side, you have the rebellion. The scrappy, marginalized underdogs who are fighting for freedom.
Right. So Lieuwma asserts that modern journalists have basically been educated to view all of human history and all current events entirely through this exact binary lens, the oppressors versus the oppressed.
So in this real-world script, who is cast as the empire?
The West. Western civilization, with its historical legacy of colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and global economic dominance, is universally cast as the empire. It is Darth Vader.
Wow.
And Lieuwma argues that because of the deep inherited colonial guilt that the West currently carries, the progressive media instinctively, almost biologically, roots for the rebellion. And the rebellion is defined as any marginalized group, regardless of the actual actions or ethics of that group.
Okay, so if we take Lieuwma's Star Wars framework and apply it to the case studies he brought up, George Floyd perfectly symbolizes the historical chokehold of the empire.
Exactly.
His death at the hands of a white police officer, an agent of the state, fits flawlessly into the narrative of the rebellion fighting systemic oppression.
Yeah, from Lieuwma's perspective, George Floyd's suffering validates the core narrative that the empire is fundamentally evil and needs to be dismantled. Because it fits the script so perfectly, it requires endless wall-to-wall coverage. It becomes a defining chapter in the fight against the empire.
But Henry Novak, he's a young white man in the West.
Right. In the subconscious Star Wars framework of the modern journalist, Novak is essentially viewed as the son of Darth Vader.
Wow, that is a brutal way to put it.
It is brutal, yeah, but Lieuwma uses it to explain the media silence. When the quote-unquote son of Darth Vader is killed by someone from a minority group, it creates massive cognitive dissonance for the journalist. It completely disrupts their neat, binary narrative. Lieuwma isn't saying the journalists consciously think he deserved it. He's saying that in the grand, sweeping narrative of the intergalactic rebellion against systemic oppression, a white victim is processed subconsciously as an acceptable casualty. It doesn't advance the plot of the script, so the script simply ignores it.
And this framework perfectly explains the Paquis de Zwigger incident, too.
Yes.
Ruud Koopmans, the white Western sociologist analyzing migration policies, is perceived by the venue's programmers as an agent of the empire.
Exactly.
He is trying to impose rules and borders. He represents the dominant power structure, so he must be banned.
Exactly. But the Hamas-affiliated activists, because they represent the Palestinian cause, which is widely coded in progressive circles as a marginalized group fighting Western imperialism, they are cast as the rebellion.
And you never, ever silence the rebellion.
Right. You hand the rebellion the microphone, even if they are literally sanctioned for terror ties. Because their extreme methods are viewed as desperate defensive measures against the empire, whereas the empire's mere existence is viewed as an act of structural violence.
Right, so Lieuwma is suggesting that the moment you criticize the rebellion, you risk aligning yourself with Darth Vader.
That is the paralyzing fear driving the progressive media, according to Lieuwma.
But hold on, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if journalists are truly just writing Star Wars fan fiction disguised as news, why does it feel so incredibly authoritative?
Yeah.
Like when I read a major feature in the Volkskrant or the New York Times, it doesn't read like a fairy tale. It reads like the absolute undeniable truth of the universe.
Right, and to answer that, Lieuwma takes us on a deep detour into literary history. He transitions from looking at what the media reports to the specific mechanics of how they write it.
Okay.
He traces this back to the evolution of storytelling, specifically a literary invention called free indirect speech.
Free indirect speech. I need a refresher on how that actually works.
Okay, so think about novels before the 19th century. They were generally told in one of two ways. You either had a strict first-person perspective, like, I walked into the room, I felt sad, or you had a very detached, godlike, omniscient narrator hovering 100 feet above the action, just stating facts. The man walked into the room, he was sad.
Right, very rigid boundaries between the author and the character.
But then writers like Leo Tolstoy and Gustave Flaubert developed free indirect speech. This is a third-person narrative, but the narrator's voice slips seamlessly into the subjective, internal thoughts and feelings of the characters without using quotes or dialogue tags.
Okay, let's make that concrete. What does that actually look like on the page?
Sure, so if traditional journalism is, the protester stood in the street and shouted at the police, free indirect speech changes it to something like, the protesters stood in the street, the cold rain biting at their faces, feeling the righteous centuries-old weight of history pushing them forward against the line of unyielding police.
Ah, so the narrator essentially becomes infected by the character's internal reality.
Exactly. And Lieuwma points to modern writers like Jonathan Franzen, who is famous for writing the modern great American novel. Franzen uses this technique masterfully to create what Lieuwma calls a hyper-immersive, zinging realism.
Right.
When you read a Franzen novel, you don't feel like you're reading a subjective perspective. You feel like the narrator's voice is reality. It's so immersive that the reader completely forgets there is an author behind the curtain pulling levers.
And Lieuwma is arguing that this specific literary sleight of hand was, like, smuggled out of the fiction section and has entirely hijacked modern journalism.
Yes. When you read a long-form feature in the NOS or even popular nonfiction books by authors like Yuval Noah Harari, they employed this exact tone. The journalist adopts this voice of omniscient, immersive authority.
Wow.
They describe a complex political debate not as a subjective observer standing on the sidelines, but as if they are channeling the objective truth of the cosmos.
It's essentially a ventriloquist act. The journalist is the ventriloquist, the article is the dummy, but the dummy is sitting there insisting, I'm a real boy, I have no strings, I am just pure, unvarnished reality.
That's a great analogy. And the most dangerous part, Lieuwma notes, is that the journalists themselves often don't realize they're doing it.
Really?
Yeah, this immersive tone is deeply tied to a philosophical concept Lieuwma calls the Fukuyama illusion.
Oh, we're talking about Francis Fukuyama.
Yeah.
A political scientist who wrote about the end of history.
Yes, we have to go back to 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses. In the aftermath, Francis Fukuyama wrote a massively influential book arguing that the ideological evolution of humanity had finally reached its endpoint.
Right, liberal Western democracy had definitively won. The grand battles of history were over.
Exactly. The idea was that we had figured out the perfect system, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the rest of the globe to catch up and adopt our enlightened ways.
Got it.
So Lieuwma argues that the entire modern journalistic class was educated within this 1990s Fukuyama illusion. They were trained in an era of immense ideological arrogance. Because they believe liberal democracy is the final perfected state of human rationality, they genuinely believe that their worldview is no longer a viewpoint. They think it is just objective reality.
So because they think they've reached the absolute pinnacle of human enlightenment, they don't even realize they have a cultural bias. They think their specific, Star Wars-flavored progressive lens is just gravity.
Precisely. They are completely blind to the fact that their objective truth is actually a highly subjective, culturally specific framework.
Wait, hold on. I understand the critique of the narrative tone and the arrogance of the 90s. But surely facts are facts.
What do you mean?
Well, if a car hits a telephone pole, that is a physical fact. Are you saying Lieuwma thinks physics and basic events are subjective? If I'm a reporter and I write, a red sedan crashed into a pole on Main Street at 2 p.m. because of a sun glare, I am stating an objective fact. Is Lieuwma suggesting that objective truth doesn't exist at all? Because that feels like we are completely unmooring ourselves from reality.
And the host of the WNL show pushed back on him with a very similar point, but Lieuwma has a very sharp rebuttal to this. He isn't arguing against physics. He is arguing against the illusion of neutral editorial selection.
Right.
He uses a brilliant analogy. He talks about isolating a human kneecap.
A kneecap. Okay, walk me through this.
So Lieuwma says, yes, you can isolate a physical event like a car crash, just like a surgeon can isolate a human kneecap on an operating table. You can look at that kneecap and objectively describe its bone density, the cartilage, the exact measurements. Those are facts.
Right, it's an objective kneecap.
But a kneecap does not exist in a vacuum. Who does it belong to? How does it connect to the femur? Is the person attached to that kneecap running an Olympic marathon, or are they lying bedridden in a hospital?
Right, the context.
Context changes the meaning of the object entirely. Lieuwma argues that the moment you, as an editor, choose to report on that specific car crash while willfully ignoring 100 other car crashes that happened in the exact same city on the exact same day, you have made a highly subjective choice.
Oh, I see. The bias isn't in the description of the crash. The bias is in the spotlight itself.
Exactly. The isolation of facts is a subjective framing mechanism.
Wow.
Why did the global media apparatus choose to isolate the kneecap of George Floyd's death and build an entire global systemic narrative around it, while completely ignoring the kneecap of Henry Novak's death? Lieuwma's point is that you cannot divorce the so-called objective fact from the highly subjective editorial priority that elevated it in the first place.
So what does this all mean? If this supposedly objective media worldview is actually just a highly curated subjective script, where does the script come from?
That's the big question.
Because the Fukuyama illusion explains why they think they are right, but it doesn't explain why the West specifically views everything through this empire versus rebellion lens. Where did this good versus evil binary actually originate?
To dig into the origins of this, Lieuwma references the work of Jonathan Pageau. Pageau is a thinker who runs a podcast called The Symbolic World, and he specializes in studying the deep underlying patterns of human storytelling.
Okay.
Pageau argues that every society, from the dawn of human history, is held together by a foundational myth.
So we are going all the way back to 30,000-year-old stories told around campfires.
Yes. But we need to understand what a myth actually is in this context. A foundational myth isn't a lie. It is a narrative mechanism. It's the core story that gives a tribe, a nation, or a civilization its shared moral compass.
Right.
It clearly defines who we are, and more importantly, it defines the ultimate evil that we stand against.
It's the glue that stops a society from splintering into a million individual factions.
Exactly. So Peugeot posits, and Lieuwma uses this to build his framework, that the modern Western world's current foundational myth was forged in the fires of the mid-20th century, specifically immediately after World War II.
Okay.
Our unifying modern campfire story became, we are the democratic West, and we defeated the ultimate absolute evil, which was Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Which makes complete historical sense. The victory over fascism is the moral anchor point of the entire post-war liberal democratic order.
Yeah.
But how does that victory explain the fractured Star Wars media bias we are seeing today?
Because, as Peugeot explains, myths inherently require extreme simplification.
What do you mean?
To make Hitler the singular, unifying archetype of absolute evil for the next century, the Western world had to sweep a massive, highly inconvenient historical truth under the rug.
What truth?
The truth that in order to defeat Hitler, the Western Allies had to form an alliance with another ultimate mass-murdering evil, Joseph Stalin and Communist Soviet Russia.
So we made a deal with the devil to beat a different devil.
Exactly.
But when it came time to write the foundational myth of the post-war era, we only wrote one of those devils into the story.
That's exactly it. We mythologized our triumph over the extreme fascist right. We codified it in our movies, our history books, and our political rhetoric. But we conveniently amnesiated our alliance with the extreme totalitarian left. And Lieuwma argues that 80 years later, we are suffering from the consequences of that missing chapter.
So it's like a cultural immune system, because our society's immune system was programmed exclusively to look for the Hitler virus, the right-wing fascist oppressor. We are hypervigilant against anything that even faintly resembles it.
Oh, we are incredibly sensitive to it. If we see a right-wing politician arguing for strict border control, our cultural alarm bells immediately scream, fascism! We know where this leads! Stop it!
Right, but because we swept Stalin and the atrocities of the radical left under the rug, our culture has absolutely zero antibodies against left-wing totalitarianism.
Lieuwma believes we are completely blind to it. We have no immune response to the Marxist logic of class struggle, which in the modern era has simply been rebranded as the struggle between identity-based oppressors and the oppressed. We don't recognize the danger of that specific ideology because it was never codified as the villain in our foundational campfire story.
Okay, let's use a metaphor here. Because this is like building a massive, beautiful house, but during construction, there was a catastrophic structural flaw in the foundation on the left side of the house.
Right.
Instead of fixing it, the builders just threw a really nice rug over it. And now, decades later, the floorboards are rotting, people are falling through the floor into the basement, and everyone standing on the right side of the house is looking around totally baffled, wondering why the house is collapsing. So we're basically dealing with a societal phantom limb.
That is exactly how Lieuwma views the current cultural landscape. We are so terrified of the monster we defeated in 1945 that we are holding the front door wide open, inviting a completely different ideological monster to walk right into our living room simply because it's wearing the clothes of the oppressed.
And this brings the entire Paquis de Zwiger incident into perfect, terrifying focus.
It does.
It explains why the venue programmers had absolutely no moral qualms about hosting Hamas-affiliated activists. The rhetoric of Hamas relies heavily on that exact Marxist dynamic, the colonized victim rising up against the imperialist oppressor.
Right.
To a progressive programmer operating under the Fukuyama illusion in the Star Wars framework, that rhetoric doesn't trigger their Hitler alarm. It registers to them as the rebellion fighting the empire. It feels righteous.
Meanwhile, Ruud Koopmans, the mild-mannered academic, suggesting that open borders might have negative sociological consequences, he triggers their hypersensitive alarm against right-wing exclusion.
So they ban the academic and hand a microphone to the extremist, all because their foundational myth has blinded them to half of the ideological spectrum. That is a deeply unsettling framework.
Yeah, it really is.
But Lieuwma doesn't just apply this to the news media and geopolitical debates, does he? I mean, he's a theater maker. He argues this exact same Marxist dynamic has completely hijacked the world of culture and art.
Yes, and this is where the WNL interview gets very personal for Lieuwma. He contrasts the artistic landscape of the 1990s with the heavily subsidized, bureaucratic cultural world we have today, particularly in Europe.
So when he talks about the 90s, he's not just talking about nostalgia, right? He's pointing to a specific type of creative energy.
Yeah, he specifically highlights figures like Hans Toyen. For context, Toyen is a legendary Dutch cabaret artist who emerged in the 90s. He was incredibly provocative, surreal, and broke every polite rule imaginable. Lieuwma also loves the origin story of Quentin Tarantino.
Oh, the classic indie film mythos.
Right.
Tarantino working a dead-end job in a video rental store, famously scraping together $35,000 and just brute forcing Reservoir Dogs into existence.
Exactly. And Lieuwma asks, what made that specific era of art so vital? From his perspective, it was defined by raw, intrinsic motivation. Artists like Tarantino and Toyen weren't trying to please a corporate board or a government bureaucracy.
Right.
They didn't pick a safe political side. They embraced moral ambivalence. They were wild, unpredictable, and they broke through purely on the undeniable intrinsic power of their art.
But today, Lieuwma argues that wildness has been entirely domesticated. It's been replaced by what he calls the modern subsidy checklist.
Yeah. In many European countries, including the Netherlands, the arts are heavily supported by municipal and national government grants, which sounds great in theory, supporting the arts. But Lieuwma details how soul-crushing and ideologically rigid the bureaucratic process to get that money has actually become.
So what does this checklist actually look like for a modern artist?
Well, to get a theater grant today, an artist has to prove in their application that their work fits a highly specific progressive mold.
Okay.
The checklist demands that your art explicitly tackles climate sustainability, that your cast and crew meet strict diversity quotas, that your narrative explicitly gives a platform to marginalized voices, and that the director demonstrates a deep academic understanding of post-colonial theory.
Wow. I mean, it doesn't sound like making art. It sounds like filling out a compliance form for a multinational corporate HR department.
It really does. Lieuwma describes the modern subsidized theater landscape as an empty cassette tape. The infrastructure is beautiful, the velvet seats, the lighting rigs, the historic buildings, but the artistic content has been hollowed out and replaced by rigid, predictable activism.
Okay, I love the romantic idea of the rogue, unfunded artist fighting the bureaucratic system, but I have to play devil's advocate and push back on Lieuwma here. Hasn't art always reflected the values of whoever is signing the checks? If we look at history, isn't a modern arts council diversity checklist just the 21st century equivalent of an artist in the Renaissance trying to please a Medici patron or the Pope? If the Pope pays you, you paint a fresco of angels. If the modern municipal government pays you, you write a play about post-colonialism. What is the fundamental difference?
That is a very fair historical comparison, and to explain the difference, Lieuwma reaches for the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, he dives into Nietzsche's concept of slave morality and the psychological driving force of resentment.
Okay, we need to slow down and unpack Nietzsche historically.
Yeah.
How does slave morality apply here?
So Nietzsche looked back at ancient history. Think of the Romans or the ancient Greeks. In those societies, the concept of good was explicitly tied to strength, vitality, wealth, and the creation of intrinsic value.
Right.
If you were a brilliant general, a successful king, or a masterful sculptor, you were good. Your power and capability defined your virtue. This was master morality.
You were good because you actively created value or conquered.
But Nietzsche observed that over centuries, largely through the rise of Judeo-Christian ethics and complex historical shifts, this morality was completely inverted.
Inverted how?
The weak, the suffering, and the underdog became automatically defined as good simply because they were weak, and the successful, the powerful, and the strong were suddenly deemed evil simply because they held power. This inversion is what Nietzsche called slave morality.
So the very state of being a victim became a virtue in and of itself.
Precisely. And Nietzsche argued that this inversion is fueled by something called resentment, which is a deep, toxic, simmering resentment of the strong by the weak.
Wow. Okay.
Lieuwma takes this Nietzschean framework and maps it directly onto the modern subsidized art world. He argues that modern cultural activism is not driven by a genuine desire to create beautiful, valuable things like a Renaissance painter trying to impress a Medici.
What is it driven by then?
Imaginary revenge. Lieuwma argues that the activist artists filling out these checklists are motivated by a deep resentment of the perceived oppressors, for example, the historical dominance of the classical white male playwright.
Okay.
Their primary intrinsic goal isn't to write a brilliant new play that moves the human spirit. Their goal is to tear down the oppressors, to grab bureaucratic power for themselves.
It's a manifestation of Nietzsche's will to power, just disguised as compassion.
Exactly.
They use the language of marginalization and victimhood,
Yeah.
not to elevate the marginalized, but to enforce their own ideological dominance over the institutions.
Yes. From Lieuwma's perspective, the subsidy checklist isn't about fostering creativity at all. It is a weapon of resentment used to gatekeep the culture, ensuring that only those who subscribe to the Star Wars worldview are allowed to create on the taxpayer's dime.
And what happens to true art in this environment?
Lieuwma insists that true, vital art always breaks through these bureaucratic walls, usually entirely outside the subsidized system. He looks back at history again, pointing to Honoré de Balzac. In 19th century Paris, the polite, gatekeeping salon culture dictated what was good art. Balzac was largely rejected by those salons for being too raw and vulgar, but his brilliant, unflinching novels outlasted every single forgotten salon darling of his era.
And who are the Balzacs of today?
Lieuwma points to controversial independent art projects like Curac in the Netherlands, which makes highly provocative films entirely outside the safe consensus of the film funds. Or he points to 21-year-old kids on YouTube.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A kid in their basement using consumer software can create a DIY horror movie or a video essay that is so authentically compelling it beats out the multi-billion-dollar Star Wars corporate franchise in daily viewership. They are creating from intrinsic motivation, not from a desire to tick a box on an oppressor-oppressed checklist.
So if the established institutions are captured by this rigid checklist of resentment, what is the inevitable outcome to the society that funds them? What happens to a Western culture that prioritizes bureaucratic box-ticking and imaginary revenge over raw, authentic creation?
Lieuwma's diagnosis is quite grim, honestly. He believes that a society trapped in this cycle of resentment inevitably sinks into a deep, inescapable mediocrity. And this realization brings us to his book.
Right, Samuel. The onverwacht verdwijning van ambiguity, which translates roughly to Samuel, the unexpected disappearance of ambiguity.
Yes.
I know this book is a blend of fiction, nonfiction, and his own autobiography. What is the core narrative thread there?
A major recurring theme in the book is Lieuwma's long-standing obsession with a musician named Richie Edwards.
Richie Edwards, the rhythm guitarist and primary lyricist for the Welsh rock band the Manic Street Preachers.
Right.
He notoriously vanished without a trace in 1995.
Yes, and for Lieuwma, Edwards represents a kind of ultimate tragic embodiment of raw, unfiltered artistic angst. He was an artist searching desperately for authentic meaning in a modern world that was feeling increasingly hollow, bureaucratic, and unambiguous.
Okay.
But the real philosophical turning point for Lieuwma, the moment all the pieces connected for him, came during a period he spent living as an expat in Tokyo.
What happened in Tokyo that shifted his perspective so radically?
He describes the visceral experience of walking through the hyper-modern streets of Tokyo. He felt the immense, forward-looking, unapologetic energy of Asia. And from that vantage point on the other side of the globe, he looked back at the West.
Right.
And it hit him with profound clarity. The West is fading.
Wow. We are sinking into our own subsidized mediocrity.
To contextualize this feeling, he references the historian Ian Morris, specifically his book, Why the West Rules for Now.
Okay.
Morris's historical analysis argues that Western global dominance is not a permanent state of affairs. It is actually just a historical blip, a roughly 500-year anomaly in a much longer human timeline where Eastern civilizations often led the globe in technology and culture.
So Lieuwma is sitting in Tokyo, realizing that the sun is quite literally setting on the Western Empire.
And he pairs that historical reality with a cultural prophecy from the controversial French novelist Michiel Lieuwma, specifically Lieuwma's book The Map and the Territory.
Okay, what's the prophecy?
Lieuwma envisions a near future where Europe is destined to become nothing more than a giant, nostalgic open-air museum.
An open-air museum.
Yes, a beautiful, tragic playground for wealthy tourists and expats from the rising East, a place where Europeans just act as well-dressed tour guides, pointing at the Colosseum, pointing at the Louvre, pointing at past cultural achievements, because we have entirely forgotten how to create new ones. We have replaced the will to create with the will to complain.
That is an incredibly brutal, depressing image. It's like watching a once great sports dynasty, a team that used to win championships every year.
Right.
But now the players are old, the management is corrupt, and the fans just sit around the crumbling stadium drinking beer, endlessly arguing about a trophy they won 50 years ago, completely ignoring the fact that the roof is literally caving in on them.
Yeah, that captures it perfectly.
But I have a serious question for Lieuwma here. If we are genuinely just the curators of a fading open-air museum, why even bother? How can you tell a young creator to just add their voice if they feel the cultural ship is already sinking into the ocean of history? What is the point of making art if the West's time is up?
This is exactly where Lieuwma pivots from his grim diagnosis to his ultimate, surprisingly resilient piece of advice.
Okay.
He synthesizes this massive critique into a call to action. He argues that you have to let go of the illusion that you can, quote-unquote, save the world through ideological art.
Right.
The activist goal of fixing society by writing a play that perfectly checks the post-colonial diversity boxes is an illusion born of ego and resentment.
So if an artist shouldn't try to fix the system, what should they do?
They need to realize that true progressivism isn't about playing the victim. It isn't about seeking imaginary revenge against historical oppressors. True art is about actively engaging in what he calls the 30,000-year-old human conversation.
The conversation that started around those very first campfires.
Exactly. From the very first human beings painting images of animals on the walls of caves in Lascaux, to Plato philosophizing in the streets of Athens, to Shakespeare writing Hamlet during a plague, to Balzac writing in Paris, to Tarantino writing in a video store, all the way down to that 21-year-old kid making a YouTube video today.
It's incredible to think about it that way.
It is one unbroken, continuous, massive dialogue about what it fundamentally means to be alive, to suffer, to love, and to exist in an ambiguous world.
And his point is that this 30,000-year conversation doesn't give a damn about your municipal subsidy checklist.
Not at all.
It doesn't care if a bureaucrat thinks you are the oppressor or the oppressed. It only cares about authenticity.
Yes. His advice to the listener and to modern creators is to completely drop the Marxist resentment. Drop Nietzsche's slave morality.
Right.
Stop whining about who currently holds the bureaucratic power. Stop participating in the Fukuyama illusion. Just synthesize the thesis and the antithesis of the world around you.
Find your intrinsic motivation.
Exactly. Find the pure, raw, unapologetic reason you want to create. And simply add your honest voice to the timeline. Your job isn't to save the Western Empire. Your job is to participate honestly in the human conversation before you die.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of philosophical and political ground today. Let's try to pull these massive threads together into a cohesive picture.
Let's do it.
We started by looking at the glaring double standards in modern media, how the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Henry Novak were treated completely differently. Lieuwma interprets this as journalists subconsciously operating on a Star Wars script, where the West is eternally cast as the evil empire, and any marginalized group is automatically cast as the righteous rebellion.
Right. And from there, we explored how that highly subjective script is cleverly disguised as objective truth.
Yes.
We looked at how the media uses immersive literary techniques like free indirect speech, combined with the arrogance of the 90s Fukuyama illusion, to make their specific cultural bias sound like the unquestionable voice of God.
And we discovered that this bias stems from a massive, unaddressed crack in the West's foundational myth. Because we defined our entire modern moral identity around defeating the right-wing evil of Hitler, we willfully blinded ourselves to our alliance with the left-wing evil of Stalinism.
Exactly.
Which explains exactly why Marxist logic, disguised as modern compassion, has been able to waltz right through the front doors of our cultural institutions without triggering any alarms whatsoever.
Institutions that, as Lieuwma argues, have now replaced raw, daring art with bureaucratic checklists driven by Nietzschean resentment. They've traded the difficult work of creating intrinsic value for the easy, imaginary revenge of tearing down perceived oppressors.
Leaving us with a culture that feels like it's slowly sinking into mediocrity, inevitably turning into Hulabek's open-air museum of past glories.
Yeah.
But the antidote, according to Lieuwma, isn't to fight the bureaucrats. The antidote is to drop the resentment, ignore the gatekeepers, and just add your authentic, intrinsic voice to the 30,000-year human conversation.
It is a profound structural challenge to how we consume information, and more importantly, how we choose to create in the modern world.
It really is. So, to you listening, the next time you read a news article that makes your blood boil, or you watch a heavily subsidized piece of media that feels more like an HR lecture than a story, I want you to pause. Look for the hidden Star Wars narrative.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Ask yourself, are you actually being told the objective truth about a complex, ambiguous world? Or are you just being fed a foundational myth designed to trigger a specific historical guilt?
It requires a fundamental, uncomfortable shift in media literacy.
And finally, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on as you go about your day. Lieuwma suggests that the West is in its autumn phase, that our 500-year blip of global dominance is ending, and we are inevitably turning into a museum as the world's energy shifts eastward.
Right.
But if that's true, what does the spring of a completely new post-Western cultural paradigm look like?
A fascinating question to ponder.
Will the next great human renaissance, the next massive leap forward in that 30,000-year conversation, be born on a heavily subsidized, culturally approved European theater stage? Or is it already germinating right now in a 21-year-old basement YouTube setup, entirely outside the system, messy, unsanctioned, and beautifully out of control? We started this deep dive talking about a feeling of invisible manipulation. Maybe the solution isn't to try and argue with the scriptwriters of the empire. Maybe the solution is to just turn off the movie, walk outside, and start writing something entirely new.